This is Deb Donig with Technically Human, a podcast about ethics and technology, where I ask what it means to be human in the age of tech. Each week, I interview industry leaders, thinkers, writers, and technologists, and I ask them about how they understand the relationship between humans and the technologies we create. We discuss how we can build a better vision for technology, one that represents the best of our human values. Welcome back to a brand new season of Technically Human. We're back after a long and relaxing summer break to bring you new episodes of the show. This past year, I've spent a lot of time thinking about the ethics of data. Teaching in UC Berkeley's program in data science and talking to some of the present and future leaders in the industry over seminars and in office hours has led me to think in new ways about the relationship between counting, that is to say measuring, and counting, that is deciding what matters. Data science and data brokers often make the claim that numbers give an objective measure of the world, and that using data-driven approaches will make our world better, where better often stands for more efficient. But a growing number of thinkers and critics are challenging these ideas and bringing their challenge into the mainstream, advocating for a human value-centric approach to data, a more equitable use of data and data science, and for protections from predatory data collection, protections that take the form of laws and governance. The researchers at Data and Society, a think tank committed to identifying and using empirical evidence to directly inform the development and governance of new technologies, and to the idea that these technologies can and must be grounded in equity and human dignity, have been instrumental in transforming public and scholarly understanding of the social implications of data, automation, and AI. They have produced some of the most important original research to inform public debate about emerging technology. In this episode, I talked to Janet Haven, the Executive Director of Data and Society. She's worked at the intersection of technology, policy, governance, and accountability for more than 20 years, both domestically and internationally. She's a member of the National Artificial Intelligence Advisory Committee, which advises President Biden and the National AI Initiative Office on a range of issues related to artificial intelligence. She also acts as an advisor to the Trust and Safety Foundation and has brought her expertise in nonprofit governance to bear through varied board memberships. She writes and speaks regularly on matters related to technology and society, federal AI research and development, and AI governance and policy. Before joining Data and Society, Janet spent more than a decade at the Open Society Foundations. There, she oversaw funding strategies and worldwide grant making related to technology, human rights, and governance, and played a substantial role in shaping the emerging international movement focused on technology and accountability. As I was preparing my interview with Janet, I realized that so many of the questions I wanted to ask her had come out of conversations with a colleague at UC Berkeley School of Information, Dr. Morgan Ames, who previously appeared as a guest on the show. Definitely check out her episode. Dr. Ames was kind enough to agree to join me today as a co-host, so you'll hear her voice on the episode too. Dr. Morgan Ames is an adjunct professor in the School of Information at UC Berkeley and the interim associate director of research for the Center for Science, Technology, Medicine, and Society at UC Berkeley, where she teaches in data science and administers the designated emphasis in science and technology studies. She's also affiliated with the Algorithmic Fairness and Opacity Working Group, the Center for Science, Technology, Society, and Policy, and the Berkeley Institute of Data Science. Hi, Morgan.
Hi, Deb.
Hi, Janet.
Hi, Deb. Hi, Morgan.
So I am delighted for this episode. Usually it is just me. Today I have one of my favorite interlocutors, Dr. Morgan Ames, here to talk together about the major questions, I think, at the intersection of data and automated technologies that leverage data in service of their automation. I figure we can just get right into it. Janet, the Data and Society Research Institute, which you direct, was founded in 2014, and that's the larger kind of rubric of our conversation today. But I wanted to talk about the relationship between the founding vision in 2014 and 2023. It's 2023. That is approximately 9 years after Data and Society was founded. And the issue of data broadly, its power, the misuse of data by bad actors and morally agnostic actors who oftentimes use data in ways that can be harmful in the pursuit of profit, the power of data, the relationship between data-centric technologies and automation and power, the major societal impact of data, especially its automated capacity, and the escalated discourse around the social impact of data-centric technologies, the need for governance, standards, and so on. Today, 2023, that's somewhat mainstream, but I'm not sure that in 2014, many people were thinking about the massive need for governance or policies in this way, at least not on the kind of massive legal, social, and ethical scale that we currently see it. Of course, now our current state of what we might call a techlash or a backlash against the harms caused by the tech industry is a somewhat kind of mainstream view, but it wasn't, I don't think, in 2014. So I wanted to ask you what was going on in 2014 that the founding members of Data and Society saw or foresaw that maybe others didn't.
Yeah, I think that's a great question because it really it captures how far we have come over the last 9 or 10 years. I should first start by saying I am not a founder of Data and Society. Data and Society was founded by Dana Boyd, who is an academic and a researcher at Microsoft Research. And what Dana really saw, and I'm interpreting a little bit here, what Dana really saw was that data-centric technologies and automated technologies will have unanticipated and potentially harmful societal consequences. And and she felt at that time like the field of research that was looking at that, and I think necessarily this has to be understood from the beginning as an interdisciplinary field of research, as a socio-technical field of research, was underdeveloped. That there was a group of researchers who were just starting to really deeply grapple with technology's potential harms and the implications, particularly for marginalized and historically vulnerable groups. And so one of the first things that Data and Society was involved with after its founding, and this was before my time, before I joined the organization, which was in very early 2016, was to help convene what turned out to be, I think, a really foundational meeting at the White House under the Obama administration that linked what we then called big data. Remember those days? Big data and civil rights. And that was a huge shift. I think that was a really significant moment to be able to bring those two ideas together, to engage civil rights organizations, to really start having that conversation about the ways in which these technologies are impacting, and as they become more ubiquitous, will increasingly impact civil rights. So I think, that was a real flag in the sand. That was a real important starting point for not just Data and Society, but for the field. And I think that what also happened at that event that was so critical, and I think, Dana and others really had the vision to see this, was the need to not only foster that field of academic research in an interdisciplinary way, but to build bridges into policy conversations and to create that translational space to be able to bring an empirical basis to the coming policymaking and governance conversations that we are deep in the weeds on now. And I think one of the things that Dana saw was that so much of the conversation around technology and its benefits and also its harms was driven by a hype cycle. That we either saw, a utopian future in which, techno solutionism was rampant, and you just, put a chip in it, and you could fix poverty, you could fix structural racism, you could fix just about everything. Or the other side, that which I think we're seeing a little bit more of a reemergence of now, which is literally that technology will kill us all and wipe humanity off the face of the planet. And so, what Data and Society was really founded to do was to build that community and create those pathways to create that empirical basis to drive this conversation and to ensure that the insights that were coming out of the research were actually useful in the governance conversations.
Thank you. Certainly, so many of my favorite people and scholars have been affiliated with Data and Society over the last 9 years. So it's incredible work you're doing. You spoke about this landmark meeting at the White House that kind of brought together the community, really made the issues that drive Data and Society visible. I would love to hear what you think other landmark events or issues or public discourse changes have occurred in this time or even before that have shifted the thinking about data centric technologies, automation, and the impact of these things in society.
Well, I think to back up, I came into this field in the late 1990s in a period of huge optimism, a period where, we only saw upsides in many ways. And, I worked at the Open Society Foundations for many years in the information program where we worked on all kinds of aspects of technology and society, particularly looking at the ways in which technology could advance human rights work and governance. I think we saw that, that come out in the movement in the sort of early 2000s in civic tech and the idea that, we could make government better and more open and more accessible to people all across, socioeconomic lines by adding technology. And I think that, a lot of what happened in the Obama administration, both the first administration, but certainly the second, was really predicated on this very optimistic idea about technology and how it can serve the public interest. And I think that was also echoed by, of course, by that being a really useful narrative for our, unregulated companies in Silicon Valley. And of course, we all remember that Google was, predicated on the idea, don't be evil. And that was something that I think had like an incredible staying power, incredible anchoring idea that was, I think, really difficult for people to get their heads around, that maybe this for-profit company wasn't actually working from a set of values or morality that was recognizable as a strong ethical stance. And so I think a lot of that broke open. What I remember, again, having been in this field for 20 odd years, I think that one of the really watershed moments was the Snowden leaks in 2013. And I think it wasn't the watershed part of it, to my way of thinking, was less about the actual information that was leaked and more about all of the sudden recognition of the way in which information and technology was about power, and that surveillance, the power to surveil, the power to collect vast amounts of data, a sort of alliance between government surveillance practices and corporate America, all of those things, I think, was just this like really shocking moment for people who worked in this field, and a recognition that we may have miscalculated, what the threats were, who the enemies were, all of those issues. So that was a really big watershed moment, I think. For people, who, and I would certainly, include both of you in this. I think for people who were doing research on the internet and society in the era leading up to the 2016 election, there was a growing storm. I mean, I think we were working on this at Data and Society at the time, and there was a growing sense of unease through late 2015, through 2016. Even as people believed that Trump couldn't possibly be elected, I think there was a growing sense of unease that the sort of euphoria around targeted campaigning and data collection that we saw in the Obama administration, about how this was the sort of new way to elect the president that we like, people suddenly realize like everybody can use this technology, and it can manipulate the ways that people understand the world around us. And there was a meme in 2016. There was a kind of coordinated early media manipulation effort around Hillary Clinton's health, her cough, that was escalated and bubbled up, and so on, and undermined the idea that she was fit for presidency and so on. Did that have any effect on the outcome of the election? Who knows? But I remember that as a sort of moment where in at Data and Society we watched a clearly intentional online effort to manipulate, and then we saw that obviously in 2016 after the election and moving forward. I think the Cambridge Analytical scandal was another big flag in the sand, which I think also pointed to another issue, which is some parts of the world are going to regulate. They're going to take steps to control this. The EU, sort of advanced over time the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, that contained a number of provisions that were about protecting individuals and their data. The enforcement of that has been a mess. So, jury's out. But the United States, after Cambridge Analytica, essentially did nothing, right? We had a lot of hearings. And I think that also was kind of a watershed moment where, in the way that you would think, well, this is the time, right? We're going to do something. And in fact, no. And I think that sets the stage for where we are right now in thinking about AI governance. So I guess the last thing I would say in terms of like a very sort of important inflection point, and this is not like a single point, but has been the incredibly important body of research and writing in our field of technology and society by Black women, by academics who are writing about the connections between race, inequality, and technology in really powerful ways, and I think have changed the conversation to really focus it very clearly on the issues of power and race and inequality. And so I'm talking about Sophia Noble's book, Algorithms of Oppression, Ruha Benjamin's work, Race After Technology, Timnit Gebru's work on stochastic parrots, Gender Shades that Joy Buolamwini did. And then I think the sort of final act, or not the final act, but kind of an important corollary to that, was Timnit Gebru's firing from Google's AI ethics team about over stochastic parrots, her publication that was really about large language models and biased data. She completely predicted everything that we are grappling with now, that we're seeing in foundation models. And I think what that firing did was it sent this very, very powerful message that I think really finally pulled the plug on the don't be evil idea, but that real tech justice work doesn't exist alongside corporate objectives, that those two things are fundamentally going to be in conflict with each other because they hit the companies at their business model.
Well, you mentioned need for governance, need for kind of maybe external bodies, right? I'd love to just take a step back and define a key term here. That is, what is governance? And along those lines, are there existing models of governance, maybe in other sectors or other contexts, that provide a framework for thinking about governance in automation, in AI?
So governance is, I think, it's great to ask what is governance, because it is a really, really broad term, and I think it can be used in a lot of different ways, some of which are somewhat conflicting, actually. Broadly, what governance means is the mechanisms by which we choose to govern, the system of how we create rules or norms or standards to constrain or guide a set of societal behaviors or actions or products. But governance can mean, and it has been used in our field to mean self-governance by industry, self-regulation, and it also has been used to mean government intervention. I think, one thing that's important to say about governance as opposed to policy making, for instance, or legislation or principles, is that governance is a system. It is a durable, it should be ideally a durable framework that works all along the life cycle of an accountability target. It's not a single intervention. It is a way of approaching a body of work or product, set of products, or even just a concept in society.
Well, if I could jump in even for a second, I wanted to pull a little bit on this because I find this idea of governance across, the many different forms that you're talking about, self-governance, for instance, policies and regulation, for instance, on the second dimension of that, on the third dimension, things like norms and standards, really, really thorny to try and figure out how those things fit together. And when I talk to folks about how we as a society should respond to or try to mitigate the harmful social impacts of data centric technologies, particularly around AI technologies and automation, we typically end up talking about the three of what I'll call the general categories of responses. One of those categories I'd call the, like roughly, I don't know, farcically, the DIY or do it yourself category, as you mentioned, which roughly suggests that responses should be left to individual people or to communities, for example, to become more, for example, digitally literate or to learn themselves how to navigate AI harms more effectively. The second of those categories I'd call the corporate responsibility category, which I'd roughly characterize as suggesting that companies reform themselves internally to better respond to enunciated principles of ethically desirable outcomes. That's kind of like the let's create principles that suggest to companies the way that they might ethically or using best practices respond. And then the third category, which I would roughly call the we need laws category, insists on legal, regulatory, and policy reform and governance with punishments, actual punishments for causing harms. Of course, I'm sure that on a certain level, it's all three in combination, as you suggest. But usually when I'm talking to somebody, they tend to foreground or put importance on one of the three. And I'm curious where you fall in your thinking about how we might prioritize these three categories or how you rank them in a hierarchy of necessary tools or responses.
Yeah. So I think that, to historically, and when I say historically, I mean like the last 20 years, we've relied really heavily on self regulation, on industry regulation, and on the idea, and I think, this is a particularly American idea, that the individual is really on the hook to manage their privacy settings, to turn down the brightness of their phone at night, to, figure out how much screen time their kids should have, et cetera, et cetera. And then we've relied really heavily on industry regulation. And in fact, we've seen, the rise of, a whole profession, the trust and safety profession, over the past, 5 to 10 years, that is, are kind of the keepers, along with legal teams at companies, of best practices in all kinds of moderation, regulation, et cetera, that the companies are imposing upon themselves. And I would say that what we've seen in that approach is that it absolutely does some good, right? Like, we just saw the entire, Twitter trust and safety team get fired, and Twitter is now like the biggest hot mess that none of us would let our children go anywhere near. Like, we know that those teams do important work and are creating meaningful standards, and are trying their best to enforce them. Those teams are also directed by their companies to address problems that are both solvable from within the company, and that are not significantly impacting the company's profits. And so, that a way to think about that, and the sort of limits of self-regulation, is the Facebook Oversight Board. And the Facebook Oversight Board is this huge effort to manage and make more transparent and more equitable and more international Facebook's content moderation efforts. The oversight board's actual remit is a very narrow part of content moderation. It's about takedowns. And when content takedowns happen, people around the world have this, pathway to raise concerns, to engage, with to engage the oversight board in philosophical debate about what it is that should stay up and should stay down, and how we interpret in the United States the First Amendment, and all of these things. My personal interpretation of that is like, that's great for Facebook because it has nothing to do with their actual ad business. It doesn't have anything to do with collecting data about people on their platforms and figuring out how to sell them ads. And so that kind of focus, I think, is something that we see a lot of in, when industry regulates itself. And so therefore, what I am really interested in, again, having sort of been in the weeds of, self-regulation for many years, is I simply think that we're at a point where government intervention and, we hope democratic government intervention with a values-based approach is really necessary, is absolutely necessary. And, if one of the things that I find really fascinating is the ways in which our current congressional members seem to have kind of come around to that point of view. If I don't know if either of you watched the recent hearings where Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, was sort of brought before the standard congressional hearing, and he did great. He totally went to the school of Zuckerberg and like got it all. He landed it all really well. But one of the things that happened in that conversation was that the senators repeatedly said, well, we got this wrong with social media and now we need to get it right. The implication being, we need to regulate, we need to make laws, etc. I think that, what's really tricky about that is obviously the devil's in the details. And in that particular hearing, what we heard was nearly content free. So, we heard calls for, please regulate us, perhaps create a new regulatory body within the government, perhaps create an international, sort of regulatory coalition between countries. Maybe we need licenses, but none of those things, all of those are empty vessels that have absolutely no content in them in terms of what are we actually saying we would regulate. And so I think that is where it gets really tricky, is that I think that we are absolutely at a moment where there's some growing consensus that government intervention is necessary, that this is an industry that's off the rails and has a dangerous concentration of power, but that there's still a lot of confusion about what that practically will mean.
So I want to push in this a little bit deeper because, what you're saying here really resonates with me. I've discovered that companies love to talk about ethics and have sometimes philosophical debates about ethics, and they'll gather and put together ethics teams, and they will allow them to deliberate, and they'll allow their deliberation and suggestions to get the ear of the CEO until those ethical recommendations and provocations interfere with the profit team's suggestions about how to make money. And so there's, I think, a fundamental problem with the self-governance kind of ethical point of view on this, simply because I think that there is a fundamental incentive structure around profit that oftentimes is orthogonal to ethical suggestions. And when the structure is ethical suggestions without any enforcement or any punishment, then the company will only take the ethics as seriously as it is convenient for their profit margins. And so, this is something that I struggle with and I think about on a daily basis. I run the Cal Poly Initiative on Ethics and Technology. And one critique of that even title, ethics and technology, that I actually really understand is that ethics is not the same thing as governance. Ethics is on a basic level how we conduct ourselves or make decisions about what we ought to do in a context where we have to choose what to do or what not to do by deliberating about what we should do in a way that maximizes a kind of comprehensive set of values, or how we maneuver in the world by following those values. You might say that ethics is exactly the opposite of the rules or laws. It's what we deliberate when there is no law or something telling us what to do. If I stop at a red light, then I'm not acting ethically. I'm following the law. So there's a kind of tension there that I wanted to tease out with you, because I think of this kind of like ethical structure as almost an opt-in opportunity for companies to get kind of social kudos, social responsibility or corporate responsibility kudos and good publicity when they do it. But they can always opt in or opt out, but they don't actually have to face any real or defined punishment when they can't or don't do ethical things because of some sort of internal conflict with profit. Usually, I think is how it goes. I wonder, how you think about the relationship in this context between values and ethics on the one hand and governance on the other. I mean, I've heard somebody say that law is codified ethics in that sense. Do you take that point of view? Do you think that our ethical standpoint is the starting off place for laws? Do you think that they are a kind of rubric of self-governance of themselves? Or how do you see the relationship between values and ethics on the one hand and laws and governance in a kind of regulatory framework on the other?
So I agree with you that ethics is a tough term to pin down when you're trying to use it to, create a governance outcome. I think that the focus on values is more effective, and I think that starting from a values framework of being explicit about what the values are that need to be centered in governance and also in technology design and deployment is how I tend to think about it. And so, when I say that, I mean using, for instance, an example of government use of an algorithmic system to allocate public benefits. If you have a value for that system that you want to essentially use that technology to make those benefits as accessible as possible to as many people as possible, you're going to design a different kind of system than if you have a value of efficiency or even a value of cost reduction. And so I think that like that is like all of those could have an a sort of ethic behind them of of public benefit or public access, but it doesn't get to, I think, the sort of core question of what is that system and what is that governance system meant to serve, or who is it meant to serve.
So I've long been a proponent. I love this talk of values and an acolyte of values in design or value sensitive design. And these are research approaches that, of course, really pay close attention to what values are built into technologies, and also the ideological frames that underlie those values. And ideological frames, of course, ideology is a complicated idea, but on a rough level, we can think about the kinds of foundational assumptions we make about our lives, about our society, etc. So I'd love to talk. You've talked about some of the values that underlie tech production, but I'd like to talk a bit more about maybe some others, and how often those values are aligned with the values of tech consumers. And if they are not, why not? How would you envision realigning them?
Yeah, well, I mean, in some ways, I will say, Morgan, I would love to hear you talk more about this because I feel like this question of values based design is one that you've thought about a great deal in your work. So maybe I'll kick us off and then kick back to you a little bit. I think that by its very nature, the default value that we see in data centric technologies, in automated systems, is one of efficiency, of increasing efficiency, like and that's such a that is such a strange term, right? Because when you see an algorithmic system, or when you're encountering a system that is meant to interact with humans, meant to interact with people, sometimes at their most vulnerable, then what efficiency means is is really contested. A scholar who I think you both know, David Robinson, recently released a book called Voices in the Code, which is fantastic. I cannot recommend it enough, that is about the social process around the creation of the kidney allocation algorithm in America, which is a nationwide system to allocate kidneys from donors to people who are desperately in need of a kidney. And so it is literally life and death. And the social production of that algorithm, the social production of that algorithm is an incredible story of people really weighing these like incredibly difficult trade-offs and weighing the sort of idea of efficiency through different lenses with other values that you can imagine are at play in a community that has a wide range of ages, that is grappling with inequality on all kinds of levels, and where kidneys are scarce. And so I think of I you know when I think about sort of the kind of ultimate story of values and design, that story to me is just really foundational because it breaks open that idea that we're using algorithms for these, somewhat like opaque and like technical reasons. We're not. We're using them in ways that are just absolutely at the core of relationships and of life. So Morgan, I'm curious what you think.
Oh gosh, that is such a fantastic book, certainly. Yeah, I think a lot about how there are a lot of underlying values and assumptions around maybe being punitive. And, this many will say these are carceral logics, right? People need to be punished, maybe. Certainly, we had spoken before about Virginia Eubanks, her really excellent work around kind of government fraud protection. I think often these sorts of systems operate within, I don't know, within a broader sense of scarcity for benefits. And so those limited benefits have to be allocated. And so there are various value judgments around who is worthy, who is not worthy, right? Who has a more worthy life, who is in more need. I think also, and my colleague Anita Say Chan writes really wonderfully about this. There's a lot of assumptions about kind of universality, right? The same thing can be applied everywhere, and everybody can benefit from the same technological intervention or solution. And there have been various scholars kind of pointing out a sort of inherent almost colonialism in that, right? Saying like, well, we know best. There's some paternalism, certainly. And of course, colonialist solutions are always more complicated in practice, because everybody has their own ideas. Everybody has some level of agency around this. But I think that, if we think about technology not just as a quote unquote tool, as even my own students will say much too often, well, technology is just a tool. Well, sure, but tools can make certain things easy and make certain things hard. And, we can say guns don't kill people, people kill people, but guns make it really easy, right? That matters. So I think a lot about those kinds of issues with that. I could say a lot more, but I'd love to kind of turn back a little bit to governance. We talked a little bit about it. We talked about how the tech sector has shown that they can't be trusted to self-govern, right? Or really be even maybe the primary architects of that kind of governance. At the same time, I feel like I've seen not great leadership, at least in the United States, around governance of technology. And some of it, I think, is just not really great advisors for some lawmakers. Some lawmakers clearly have amazing advisors and they're very up to date on what's going on, but quite a few really fall into either tech boosterism or kind of dystopian thinking themselves in a way that troubles me. And as you said earlier, enforcement of GDPR has been a mess. So I think one question I have for you, maybe we can't fully answer it, right? But who should govern these kinds of AI automation systems. And particularly when we think about a globalized context where tech companies work internationally, right? There isn't one set of values maybe that will fit in all of those contexts. The impact of these technologies have causal change across borders, across different countries. So who should be in charge of these sorts of things?
Yes. So I guess I will start by just making a strong plug for participatory methods of governance. And I think there's the jury is out on what that looks like in algorithmic governance, in governance of data centric technologies. But we kind of know how to do it in other sectors. There have been lots and lots of experiments and, functional systems that allow for public input from impacted communities into critical decision making. And I think that there's a real tendency to fall back into what our mutual colleague, Professor Jenna Burrell, calls the coding elite, in thinking that technology governance needs to be handled by the technologists, that technologists know best about how we think about the impacts of these systems, and that needs to stay at that level because this is all technical stuff. It's just too hard for normal people to understand. I won't say the word on the podcast that comes to mind for me when I hear that, but it is, I think that's fundamentally untrue. I certainly think that technologists play an important role. That's not to say they shouldn't be part of the consultation, but I think that the idea that we need to lean into a sort of world in which technical knowledge is also how we determine kind of social outcomes is completely wrong. As to who should govern, kind of from a more like practical perspective, in this moment, for instance, one of the things. So I sit on the National AI Advisory Committee to the White House, and so our job as a committee, we're a FACA, federal advisory committee made up of citizens that have been convened under the Department of Commerce to advise the National AI Initiative Office and the president about how they should be approaching AI. And one of the things that's been actually incredibly heartening in doing that work over the past year is learning the degree of expertise that there already is in the government. So we definitely lack capacity. We need many, many more people who have that sort of bridging and translating expertise to understand and think through what the social and legal and political and cultural implications of technology are and how that translates into a regulatory approach. But we have some really strong starting points inside the government right now. The Office of Science and Technology Policy, which is kind of like an internal think tank on science and technology that sits within the White House, that sits within the executive branch, released a really important document in October of last year, of 2022, called the Blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. And what it articulated was a 5 point set of rights that they believed every American should have access to. And they worked very, very closely with agencies across the executive branch to think through practically, because of course this is not law, right? This is more like a sort of government white paper, as it were, to think really practically about how to take those principles and move them into practice, and to, in some cases, find existing regulatory or legal devices that actually support their enactment and enforcement. So those principles are things like safe and effective systems, human fallback, protection from algorithmic discriminations, data privacy. So these are sort of basic values based and evidence based principles that are, it turns out, are actually, some of them are actually already, protected under existing civil rights law that just hadn't been kind of deployed in that way. Interesting. So that came out in October. In February, President Biden released an executive order that was called Further Advancing Racial Equity, which built on the executive order he put out on his first day in office in 2021, called Advancing Racial Equity. And in that executive order that he put out in February of this year, he pulled the language about protections against algorithmic discrimination, which is like, a frontier idea in civil rights. And he put it in the executive order and said all of the agencies in the executive branch are now required to do this, to protect against algorithmic discrimination. And so, like, those are the kinds of steps that I feel very heartened by, because I think that there is a group of people inside the government that are paying very close attention to this moment, and that are, drawing on deep expertise to move it forward. I think the legislative environment in right now on the Hill is a little bit more scattered. There are a number of, there are a number of proposed legislations that would be incredibly useful to pass, like the American Data Protection and Privacy Act, which would create a, comprehensive federal data privacy law, which we, like, bizarrely do not have in the United States, like every other country on earth pretty much does. The Algorithmic Accountability Act, which is coming out of Senator Wyden's office, came out in 2022, 2019, and then again in 2022. And that is a really strong, I think, piece of legislation that calls for algorithmic impact assessments for systems above a certain size. We also have seen the sort of release of the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, NIST, put out, I think, a really important document, the AI Risk Management Framework, which is again, not enforceable, but is a proposal for developing a set of standards for the governance of AI. Standards are not rights-based, and they're not, enforceable, but they are a baseline that the government is kind of putting out as a way to think about AI governance that is grounded in a values-based and socio-technical framework. So there are some really, I think, important steps that are happening. I think what we're missing, honestly, in the governance side is a big picture, sort of strategic set of commitments from the US government to say, this is the values framework that we intend to use to build that durable governance framework for AI. Morgan, what do you think?
I'm so glad you mentioned that office. Certainly, my brilliant colleague Deirdre Mulligan is part of that
Yes.
right now, although UC Berkeley School of Information greatly misses her. But I mean, among other things, in her writing, she advocates for open deliberative processes around software development, which is very different from how it's done now, right? But this would be taking a page from other, deliberative government processes that hold public hearings and really think carefully about that. On the other hand, though, I remember I was told during my undergrad degree in computer science at UC Berkeley back in the early 2000s that tech people were the smartest people in the room, that we were the smartest people in the room, that these tools of scale and modularity and abstraction that we were learning could literally solve any problem. And I remember even at the time, I kind of rolled my eyes about that, but journalists echo that kind of trope all the time, even now. So I feel like we really have our work cut out for us to say, no, 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 we need to decenter the quote unquote tech expertise, not to say that they aren't experts in their field, but to apply that expertise all across all sorts of other fields just seems very misguided.
Right. And I would just add to that, when we're talking about AI, when we're talking about tech, what I think gets left out is that these are socio-technical systems. I like that term, socio-technical system, because it connects the technology to the fact that the technology is always aimed at causing a change in human behavior or facilitating some sort of human interaction. And the idea that we can, mechanize and allow computers to self-enact certain processes leaves out the fact that when a technologist creates a product, the end aim is the interface with human beings. And I guess, this puts into sharp focus for me both the fact that we need other people deliberating how these systems should function, how they might be restricted, and those other people need to come from the different areas where the technology has its impact and where it interfaces with human beings. This is something that I think, Janet, you're uniquely posited to talk about, because I know that Data and Society has recently launched the Algorithmic Impact Lab to think through precisely the kinds of questions about how technologies, particularly data technologies that enable automated interface, link up with human beings. And I wonder if you could talk about the Algorithmic Impact Lab as a project. How do you decide, or how should we decide, what exactly gets automated? How should we decide what kinds of technologies we want to replace the deliberative human function or a social connection? How do we decide what junctures the human interface should interact with a kind of mechanized process? I guess the larger question here is, should we automate as many things as can be automated? That certainly seems to be a premise of technological innovation when it comes to AI. But should we? Why or why not?
Yeah, well, so first, thank you for giving me an opportunity to talk about the project you mentioned that we recently launched. It's called the Algorithmic Impact Methods Lab, and we launched it a couple of weeks ago. What this project is about is it is a next step in the work that we've been doing for the past several years at Data and Society on algorithmic impact assessments. And what algorithmic impact assessments are is, is a way of assessing the societal impact, both, intended and unintended, positive and negative, of an algorithmic system. And I think particularly thinking about the impact of those systems on historically marginalized groups and vulnerable populations. So the Algorithmic Impact Methods Lab is responding to a kind of like interesting moment that we're in the governance space, actually going back to that point, which is the idea of algorithmic impact assessments has really taken hold in governance language, right? They show up in the EU AI Act, they show up in the Algorithmic Accountability Act that I mentioned that Senator Wyden's office is working on. They have shown up in many different places. Actually, the NTIA, one of the agencies in the executive branch, has like a huge call for public comment right now about specifically about algorithmic impact assessments. The problem with them is right now there is no agreed upon way to do them. And the default sort of methodology would be to essentially say, like, well, the companies can figure this one out, right? Like they'll tell us how to do an impact assessment, which kicks us right back into the world of industry self-regulation. And I think that is a danger that, that we see potentially playing out in governance, is that, there's a high level law or regulation that gets passed, but essentially it's left to companies to implement it without, a kind of like public guidelines or rulemaking about like how that thing should actually happen. Again, the devil is in the details. So, one of the things that we're most concerned about at Data and Society is that idea of impact assessments will essentially be captured by industry, and that we do not have at this point a gold standard for what a public interest algorithmic impact assessment should look like. One that is, again, going back to Deirdre's point that you mentioned, Deirdre Mulligan's point, one that is participatory, one that is actually bringing in the voices and experiences and centering not just in sort of data collection, but in actual power, the impacted communities. So that is the sort of core of that project. And we do have models for what impact assessments can look like. For instance, environmental impact assessments are, an existing tool in the environmental justice and governance space that, we've drawn on heavily. Human rights impact assessments are another one. So that's where we have what we've drawn on, and in launching the Algorithmic Impact Methods Lab, which we also call the AIM Lab. So we're really excited to get that moving forward with a group of partners, and are hoping to be putting some work out over the coming months. But that kind of doesn't entirely answer your question, which is like, I think a much more, kind of philosophical and, big picture societal question about what we should automate. And again, I'm looking at the two of you who have such expertise and depth in this subject. And so I am going to say a couple of things, and then I really would love to hear what both of you think about this. I would start by saying, first of all, I don't know. I don't think there's a hard line. I think we've seen some really, really important experiments in banning the use of certain types of automation. For instance, the use of, facial recognition by law enforcement agencies is one way that we've seen limitations put on, where we say, okay, we don't want to automate this. But I don't think that really gets to the question that we need to talk about, as, broadly as a society. And I think this is where we really separate from a conversation about formal governance, which is that I think that there are really significant questions about what we automate, what binds us as a society, what makes us human, that aren't going to be covered by like civil rights law or, regulatory action, by the DOJ or something like that. Those are, I think, deep societal conversations that we need to have, and that I don't think we have great spaces to have those in right now. And so I mean, I will say the area that I am thinking a lot about in recent months around that question is care work. I think that there is a kind of obvious trajectory towards the automation of care work. And I think, we're already seeing experiments with it. And when I say care work, I mean that really broadly, right? Like, we spend a lot of mostly unpaid or low paid time in our society caring for people, caring for children, caring for adults who are and others who are, experiencing disabilities, caring for older people. And I would include broadly in care work, I would think of education as being part of that, particularly early child education. And that is an area that troubles me, and that I think about a lot, that's not really going to be covered by governance. There's no at least like in the governance conversations I'm in, like, nobody's talking about that. And yet I think that where technology intersects with human outcomes, that area is profound, both in terms of the experiences that people have at maybe the beginnings and the ends of their lives, and what it means for the people in the middle when we are assigning those kinds of care tasks out to, potentially automated systems and robots. And I will just say one last thing on this, and then I want to hand it off to you, which is a great book on this that I have just read, which maybe both of you have encountered already, is called Robots Won't Save Japan. It's written by James Wright. He did this deep ethnographic study of the Japanese government's sort of plan to deal with their, anticipated, population, bomb of aging people, and their sort of complete aversion to immigration in the country, so they don't have a access to a low wage caregiving population. And so they embarked on this kind of national program to build, a robot intervention to care for their elderly. It is a great book. And I really recommend it for people who are thinking about this.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this for a while. I remember, I think it was maybe 2012 or 2013 when I read Sherry Turkle's book called Alone Together, where she talks about the activity of caregiving. It's something that I've been thinking about quite recently, the more I think about kind of the principles of engineering itself as a kind of force that undergirds our technological production. And what engineering essentially holds as its core principle is the idea of making something more efficient. It's making X thing more efficient and therefore making it more profitable. And it's very convenient that the idea of profit is aligned with the idea of efficiency because it makes a kind of capitalistic impulse which undergirds the system of technological production in the United States as well, very compatible with the logic of technological production. Of course, many of us who are thinking about this in humanistic terms really, I think, understand that the variety and diversity and the multitude of human values are not always compatible with the idea of efficiency. Things like love or care, I would argue, are actually orthogonal to the idea of efficiency. I think about myself and how I want to be loved. And very rarely do I want to be loved efficiently, although maybe my partner thinks differently. But when I ask undergraduates, how many of you are in a relationship? Some of them raised their hands. I said, how many of you want a relationship or at least want, somebody who cares about you on a romantic scale? And some of them raise their hands. And by the end of the questions that I ask about how many of them want a kind of romantic, caring partnership, everybody's got a hand in the air. And I said, well, how many of you want that person to love you efficiently? And there's a lot of snickers and giggles because I don't think that many of us really, when we think about how we want to be handled by a romantic partner, say, yes, please be as efficient as possible, right? When we think about how we want to engage in some of the most important and basic practices of our daily life, such as eating, right? Very rarely, I think, do I sit down to a meal with people I care about to eat efficiently. I eat for pleasure. I eat because it's my grandmother's recipe and she left a country under duress. And the only thing that she could take with her are the recipes. And that allowed her to create the material life that she left behind. And I make that recipe because it's been handed down to me from somebody dear. Or I make a course meal for my romantic other so that we can enjoy a luxurious meal, or I eat because it tastes good, right? So all of those things have nothing to do with efficiency. And yet, if we look at the logic by which we decide which technologies to incorporate or which technologies to build, most of them have that principle as the primary principle. So I guess, get a little bit sad when I see that the majority and the diversity of human values that I think we ought to live by become so subservient to this one logic of efficiency. And I wonder whether there's a way out of this that you see if we can't fundamentally change both the expectation that technologists who oftentimes have training that lead them toward that efficiency principle, and then incentive structures that also prioritize the efficiency principle because it is, as I said, the logic of capitalism. Like, is there any possibility of changing this, or are we all going to one day be cared for efficiently by robots?
I want to know what Morgan
Oh
thinks.
goodness. I so I'm I'm reminded of a paper it actually came out in 2001, but I still teach with it because I feel like it's just more prescient, more relevant now than ever. It was so prescient at the time, and it was written by Mark Ackerman, computer-supported cooperative work researcher, called the socio-technical gap. And he talks about how basically machines, when we try to automate systems, especially ones that involve our social worlds in various ways, there are always things that the machines can't do and that the machines don't quite understand, right? There's a lot of nuance, there's a lot of interpretation. The talk of efficiency also reminds me of all these movements for slow food, slow scholarship, right? And of course, this is pushing back not just against tech, but against our larger capitalistic system. But I wonder if, just riffing on both the socio-technical gap, right? What machines maybe can never do. And it's not just a matter of, another 5 years. There's likely social nuance, care work potentially that maybe can never really be automated. So I think a lot about those, but I'd love to hear a little bit from you, Janet. We've talked a bit about care work, about love. Are there things, maybe these are them or other things that should absolutely not be automated? We should just stop trying because we are undermining, maybe we're undermining our very humanity. Maybe we're undermining the values that we should be centering in making a life worth living.
Well, I mean, I will put a plug in. I don't think this is quite what you're looking for, but I'll put a plug in for the campaign to stop killer robots. And I think that the work that that group has done, continues to do, to draw attention to the use of automated systems in warfare is really, really critical. And so everybody should give them money. But I think beyond those kind of uses, and I feel like you're thinking about the more, the more day-to-day applications of technology and of AI that we may encounter. I think the way that I would arrive at an answer to that question, which I don't have right now, is to think about work that, for instance, Madeline Ellish, who was a researcher at Data and Society, who was one of the founding members of our AI on the ground research program that now has launched the AIM Lab. Madeline has moved on to onto Google, where she's a researcher. She wrote a paper very early on that I loved, a piece of research called AI in Context, that talked about the ways in which, we tend to talk about AI as sort of replacing, and or automated systems as replacers of humans, human action, human behavior. And her argument was that in reality, and this is of course gets to like the sort of core of the socio-technical system, that we need to understand AI systems as integrative, as in the future working alongside and with people. And she didn't, I would say, I don't think she put a strong value judgment on that. It was an empirical piece of work. But I think that, like, thinking about it that way, to me, is at least somewhat soothing, and more compelling. And I guess thinking about that in the context of elder care, for instance, there are ways in which you can imagine a humanoid automated system might do a better job at, like, making sure that older people are getting the medications that they need, or that there's like a very quick response time when somebody is in danger or something like that. But that there are also types of care work that we would never want to automate, and that we would never want to take the humanity out of an exchange of care. And so I think that takes me back to the feeling that we do need more spaces to have these debates around, like, and not so much in theory, not so much in theory or at 10,000 feet, but in, like, really clear, specific examples, such as the one that I mentioned that David Robinson put forward in his book Voices on the Code, about the kidney allocation algorithm, which is, again, I think, a great example of what participatory methods and decision making around the use of automation look like when lives are at stake.
I want to kind of ask a big picture question, as we're kind of winding down to the end. What is data and society's ultimate vision for data and for society? On a big picture scale, what kinds of ideals and aims and outcomes do you ultimately want to help usher into being or see come into?
Our organizational vision is that the values, and this takes us right back to the beginning of talking about values, but that the values that inform and shape technology are visible and are intentionally chosen with respect for human dignity and for just outcomes. And I think that is obviously pretty reductionist in terms of a whole organization's set of goals and vision. But I think in many ways that's what we are really working towards in all of our work, is that we see a values based, human centric approach to to technology use and development and deployment and design, rather than one that's driven purely by efficiency, innovation, and, kind of capitalist markers.
I think we have time for one last question, Morgan. You want to ask it?
Yeah, sure. So Deb and I co-teach a course in the graduate data science program at Berkeley on the context of data and human values. I know she also teaches courses at Cal Poly on ethics and tech. And we talk a lot to students who represent the next generation of thinkers and leaders and workers in the tech industry. I would love to know what you would want those listeners, maybe people in tech focused programs who are studying ethics and human values, what would you want them to know or think about or be aware of as they move forward in their careers?
Yeah, there are two things that I think I would say. So one is like kind of the practical career advice, which is I think they're in a great place. I think this is going to be a growing field. And I think particularly for people who are interested in working in public interest technology and broadly in the public interest, that there are going to be a lot of opportunities. I think part of what's really exciting for that cohort, for this cohort that you're teaching right now, is that we're kind of at a moment of like role creation, that there are, I think that there are new types of jobs that are going to be emerging that we don't even really understand what those are yet, but that translational ability is going to be, I think, in high demand, and is going to be really, really important in shaping what our society looks like. I think the second thing that I would say is more, kind of philosophical, which is that which is again going back to the idea that values are really what undergird so much of this, in my opinion. That if we're not starting from a shared set of visible and intentionally chosen values when we're talking about technology and society, that governance doesn't really do much for us. We can govern in any direction that we want to. China, for instance, has a pretty robust set of regulatory controls around algorithmic systems that are reflective of their values and their governance system. And they are not the ones that I think we would want to adopt in the United States. So if we want a human-centric society in which we are protecting the most vulnerable in our society and a broad set of rights are being advanced, we have to make that choice intentionally. I think we have to push back on a narrative of a lack of societal agency. And I think that we need to think about how people who are coming up as leaders take more agency and direct how we want technology to develop and technology governance to develop. I think it's an opportunity that is open right now, and we definitely need more people in the field.
I think that's a great note to end on. Morgan, thank you very much for signing on as co-host. Janet, thank you very much for coming on to the conversation today. It's been a pleasure talking to you both.
It was sure a joy to be part of it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, well, thank you both so much for having me on. This has been a lot of fun.
Welcome back to a brand new season of Technical Human. We're back after a long and relaxing summer break to bring you new episodes of the show. This past year, I've spent a lot of time thinking about the ethics of data. Teaching in UC Berkeley's program in data science and talking to some of the present and future leaders in the industry over seminars and in office hours has led me to think in new ways about the relationship between counting, that is to say, measuring, and counting, that is, deciding what matters. Data science and data brokers often make the claim that numbers give an objective measure of the world, and that using data-driven approaches will make our world better, where better often stands for more efficient. But a growing number of thinkers and critics are challenging these ideas and bringing their challenge into the mainstream, advocating for a human value-centric approach to data, a more equitable use of data and data science, and for protections from predatory data collection, protections that take the form of laws and of governance. The researchers at Data and Society, a think tank committed to identifying and using empirical evidence to directly inform the development and governance of new technologies, and to the idea that these technologies can and must be grounded in equity and human dignity, have been instrumental in transforming the public and scholarly understanding of the social implications of data, automation, and AI. They have produced some of the most important original research to inform public debate about emerging technology. In this episode, I talked to Janet Haven, the Executive Director of Data and Society. She's worked at the intersection of technology, policy, governance, and accountability for more than 20 years, both domestically and internationally. She's a member of the National Artificial Intelligence Advisory Committee, which advises President Biden and the National AI Initiative Office on a range of issues related to artificial intelligence. She also acts as an advisor to the Trust and Safety Foundation and has brought her expertise in nonprofit governance to bear through varied board memberships. She writes and speaks regularly on matters related to technology and society, federal AI research and development, and AI governance and policy. Before joining Data and Society, Janet spent more than a decade at the Open Society Foundations. There, she oversaw funding strategies and worldwide grant-making related to technology, human rights, and governance, and played a substantial role in shaping the emerging international field focused on technology and accountability. As I was preparing my interview with Janet, I realized that so many of the questions I wanted to ask her had come out of conversations with a colleague at UC Berkeley School of Information, Dr. Morgan Ames, who previously appeared as a guest on the show. Definitely check out her episode. Dr. Ames was kind enough to agree to join me today as a co-host, so you'll hear her voice on the episode too. Dr. Morgan Ames is an adjunct professor in the School of Information at UC Berkeley and the interim associate director of research for the Center for Science, Technology, Medicine, and Society at UC Berkeley, where she teaches in data science and administers the designated emphasis in science and technology studies. She's also affiliated with the Algorithmic Fairness and Opacity Working Group, the Center for Science, Technology, Society, and Policy, and the Berkeley Institute of Data Science. In this episode of the show, I sit down with Lauren Maffeo to talk about data governance. Lauren Maffeo is an award-winning designer and an analyst who In this episode of the show, I sit down with Lauren Maffeo to talk about data governance. Data Maffeo is an award-winning designer and an analyst who currently works as a service designer at Steampunk, a human-centered design firm serving the federal government. She's also a founding editor of Springer's AI and Ethics Journal and an adjunct lecturer in the interaction design at the George Washington University. Her first book, Designing Data Governance from the Ground Up, is available from The Pragmatic Programmers. Lauren has written for Harvard Data Science Review, the Financial Times, and The Guardian, among other publications. She's a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, a former member of the Association for Computing Machinery's Distinguished Speakers Program, and a member of the International Academy of Digital Arts and Sciences, where she helps judge the Webby Awards.